Hello, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Tune in next week for History is Lunch, when we'll be joined from Boston by Kate Clifford Larson, author of a new biography on Fannie Lou Hamer. Today, we are delighted to be joined from North Carolina by Betty R. Dickson, the author of Leaving Mississippi. The Mendenhall native began a newspaper career at age 12 as a printer's devil at the Simpson County News. She graduated from the University of Southern Mississippi with a degree in liberal arts with a journalism major and worked for newspapers in Lucedale and Philadelphia. In 1970, Dickson and her husband Tom became publishers of the McGee Courier. After selling the newspaper in 1984, Betty Dickson became executive director of the Mississippi Nurses Association. She continued as a lobbyist after retirement from that association, and Dickson now lives in Asheville, North Carolina. Leaving Mississippi is her first book. Welcome, Betty Dickson.
Thank you. It's good to be back home in Mississippi, even if it's virtual. I want to introduce you to Martha Lee and our book, Leaving Mississippi. Both Martha Lee and I left Mississippi, but for different reasons. We agreed that those of us who were born here and who grew up here never really leave Mississippi. Actually, Mississippi won't let you leave. They're tugging at you at every day. But thank you, Chris Goodwin, and the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, and your boss, Katie Blunt. I cannot say enough about this department. The people, the volunteers and the staff are preserving our history. They take care of our government records, historic papers, documents, photographs, maps, everything. They had me over there with patience and experience when they were teaching me how to search Mississippi newspapers for the book. I called the machines cantankerous, and I stand by that. But they were so helpful. Let me give you an example of what this institution does for us. I was looking for military information for my book, and one of the volunteers sent me to a man behind a desk over in that room, and I told him what I needed. In less than 5 minutes, he had it all there. I mean, they're experts, and I respect them so much. You should visit him every once in a while. It's good. The first thing I had to do was to find Martha Lee. When Mother down in Mendenhall was in her last days on this earth, I had to go down on weekends to take care of her. She had sitters during the week, and then the weekends were mine. And they were long weekends. And I would sit out on the back porch with nothing to do, really. But I'd started stopping by the courthouse to check out volumes of the Simpson County News and to begin to think about writing a book. Now, you know, those volumes are like this newspaper size and big, and they were bound. So I would sit there and I would look, and I would just continuing to look for things. And I remembered many, many times that around age 12 and 13, my brother and I, we were only 16 months apart, but my brother and I had watched the offloading of the portable electric chair into the Simpson County Courthouse where Jim Brent Durr was to be killed that night. We watched and we rode behind the trailer all the way up Main Street. And it was one of those situations where as we went up the hill, more and more people came out of those stores and watched as they moved that awful contraption up the hill. It was carried on a flatbed trailer and had generators and lots of cables. Throughout my life, I recall that story many times. Leafing through the 1951 volume, I found the very small 1 column by 1 inch article, by 4 inch article, 1 by 4, in the Simpson County News. Short, Negro kills constable, charged with murder. Wife also arrested and charged with accessory to murder. There it was, the memory that followed me my whole life. My newspaper background kind of kicked in and I started my research. It was a slow process, but when I finally retired at age 75, I got serious about this story. Living in McGee for 15 years, I had a lot of friends in the school system, teachers, administrators. I was also elected to the Simpson County School Board, which my mother said was the craziest thing I ever did. I started making calls about the Durr family and see if I could find out how I could start finding Martha Lee. And so I ran into one good source, though, and so using deep south directions, and most of you will understand these, I was told to head down 49, Highway 49, watch for the sign that said Skiffer Community, take a right, follow the road to the water tower. When you get to the water tower, turn left, and Willie Bell McDonald, Martha Lee's sister, lives in that first house on the left. Perfectly good directions. I understood them. My source even gave me Willie Bell's telephone number. I called ahead and asked if I could visit with her. She granted my wish. I arrived in my car with a North Carolina tag. Her reception was somewhat cool. 15 minutes later, someone came to the back door and asked, "Who is here from North Carolina?" It was Willie Bell's son, Hayward McDonald. Hayward and I knew each other from the newspaper days. I walked over and I said, "I know you." And he said, "I know you too." And after a big hug, I was just knowing that this had been a good thing that had just happened, because I had helped him with his advertising and we were good friends. And he turned to his mom and he said, "You can talk to her, you can trust her." And the next thing I know, Willie Bell has picked up the telephone, punched some numbers in it, and in an instant, I was talking with Martha Lee Hall in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Who would have thought? Willie Bell and Martha Lee are in their 90s and are still very close. They're only 1 year apart. So I flew to Grand Rapids and met Martha Lee and her daughter Betty for lunch the next day. She agreed to an interview, and for 2 days, we worked really hard. Thankfully, her daughter Betty is a professional photographer and she recorded our interviews. I was pretty amazed at Martha Lee's memory, her attitude, her sorrow, and her sense of humor. Imagine pink flip-flops that matched her pink toenails. Martha Lee was stylish. It was hard for her and for me, but more for her. As she described the 400 plus posse that watched as she was questioned in the parking lot of a nearby church. It was hard when she described the jail, for I had seen that jail when I was young. It was hard when she talked about protecting her children. It was hard when she talked about walking 4 miles to her sister's house to take her children after the shooting in the dark. I found it interesting that an article in the Clarion Ledger quoted Colonel T.B. Birdsong describing the hunt for Durr. Quoting Birdsong, who was head of the Mississippi Highway Patrol, said, "At times there were 500 to 600 people and law enforcement officers in the posse. There was no threat of mob violence or demonstration, and that people were most cooperative." Now, I made every effort in this book, in writing this book, to remain as factual as possible, because it was a true story. If you were a Negro woman and you had been jerked around, pushed and shoved while being questioned, and you were in custody, and you were 8 months pregnant, and you were facing 400 white men with guns on their shoulders in the back of pickup trucks, would you describe the incident as no threat? The first session left us both exhausted. So Martha Lee suggested we take a tour of her apartment complex. Here, she's in her element. She introduced me to her friends and neighbors. And what I learned is that Martha Lee is a character. She is funny. She is loving, especially when she talks about her children. She's strong because circumstances have made her that way. She's tough. She has a long, long, hard life, but has adjusted to every roadblock tossed in her way. Her friends love her. You could see it in their greetings. She really is just a joy. Her story starts down at the farm where they were sharecropping. She was in the field, bursting clods of dirt to make rows, 8 months pregnant. It was springtime. They needed to get seed in the ground. And her husband was in the bed, running fever. He had the mumps. And she was pretty emotional about the constable coming around about a loan for a wagon. Her husband had not discussed the loan with her, but she knew that they had a bad crop the year before, and that also that Jim Brent had agreed to use the crop as collateral on the loan. She had learned that from the papers delivered to him by the constable on a previous visit. She sensed that they were in trouble, but did not understand why it had gone this far. The interview was hard, especially when she described the day her husband killed Bernice Harrington. The constable. Harrington was a neighbor of the Durrs. Durr had signed a loan for a wagon, a necessary piece of equipment on a farm. Harrington came to the house alone the first time, perhaps in an attempt to get something worked out before the issue went any further. Martha Lee remembers it had started, a heavy rain had started, and they stood on the porch for a while waiting for it to be over. She remembers the visit as pleasant between the two men. There is some discrepancy in the story as to whether there were 2 or 3 visits, according to Martha Lee. It was on the second visit that Harrington served legal papers on Durr, a writ of replevin, asking for either payment on the wagon or the wagon itself. But Harrington had told him that the guy who loaned him the wagon, or who held the loan, that he didn't want the wagon back. He just wanted the money. Basically, he was calling in a loan. The next visit, Harrington had brought more papers. This time he was being charged with resisting the officer in his attempted execution of the process. So now we have first visit or second visit. He was shown the writ of replevin, and then second time it was even more charges. But what he did, what Harrington did, according to Martha Lee and to the appeal process, that upon arrival at the house that day, Harrington walked down to the field where Martha Lee was working and asked her to come up to the house with him. Maybe he was afraid of Durr. Durr had already told their oldest child to tell Harrington to come to the house where he was in bed and running a fever. Instead, Harrington wanted Martha Lee to be there. So Martha Lee recalls leaving Harrington in the front of the house, and she came around to the back, and the 2 men were standing at the foot of the bed, the 2 officers. Martha Lee's account had her holding their 9-month-old infant in her arms. She was close to Harrington's brother on that side of the bed, who had a shotgun. Hearing angry words being exchanged, Martha Lee saw the brother point the gun toward Jim Brent, and she lurched. And the baby slowly slid down to the floor. Stepping over her child, Martha Lee said she reached for the gun, and the 2 wrestled it out of the room and out into the front yard. Martha Lee said her intention was to get the gun out of her house, away from the children. While out front, Martha Lee heard a gunshot from the house. Meanwhile, back in the house, Durr and Harrington were arguing, and Harrington went out into the yard to see about his brother. Harrington pointed his pistol toward Martha Lee and told her to let go of his brother. He continued to point his gun toward her, and when Durr stepped onto the porch with his gun, he shouted to Harrington to put the gun down and not to point it towards his wife. At that point, Durr shot Harrington, who walked a few yards to his truck and fell to the ground. The brother came over to Harrington, realized he was dead, got in the truck, and left the scene. As a newspaper reporter for many, many years, it was always difficult piecing the pictures together after a terrible scene that included built-up anger, rushing fear, and two sides of the story. The one thing that I couldn't figure out is Martha Lee described the wrestling match with the brother in great detail, with a broom, holding the broom, how she had it and how he had it and how they wrestled. Yet in the Supreme Court appeal, there was nothing about the two having this fight over the gun. Martha Lee spent 6 months in jail, and at some point, the charge of accessory to murder was dropped. I could never find an entry in the docket that they dropped the charges from Martha Lee. I think she loved him, although she did tell me I didn't know what love was, meaning I'm quoting her. But she showed me a picture of him in his Army uniform. His disregard shows through his fedora on top of his head. Now, my husband was in the military for a long time, and I know what the cover is supposed to look like. It's just a little flat piece that opens up. But he didn't have it on the regular military, the military issue cover. He had that same old fedora right up here on the head. And he had that fedora on top of his head with the uniform. In pictures later that I found of his arrest, he still had that same old fedora. He was a small man, short and angry. He was in the Army, enlisted just as the Germans had surrendered. So he didn't see any combat. He came from a large family. It was rumored that his mother had close to 20 children, and his father was also noted as hating white folks. Jim Brent had moved into a new community. He married Martha Lee, and now he was being pressured on a $40 loan, even though he knew that the crops did not do well last season. Perhaps he was feeling a little hemmed in. Since I couldn't find an account of the trial, I searched through the files at the Supreme Court building in Jackson, looking for a copy of the appeal. Obviously, the copy of the trial had been destroyed in a flood in the basement of the Simpson County courthouse. So I obtained the number on Durr's appeal so I could go back and find it. And they were very helpful there too. So what was interesting was that the numbers before and after Durr's appeal were there. But Durr's appeal was not. So I ended up scratching my head, wondering why in the world those were missing. But I needed a copy of that because it would give us all the information that we needed about what the court was looking at or what the justices were looking at. So I came back home and did an internet search and was pretty surprised, but very happy to have found a copy of the appeal on the internet. So to start the interview with Martha Lee, I explained the appeal process and asked her to listen as I read her the Supreme Court decision. She should stop me and respond with her version when it was different from her recall. Durr's court-appointed attorney was highly respected, well-educated, and known to be a very competent attorney. He represented Durr during the trial and after a guilty verdict, appealed Durr's case to the Supreme Court. But two of my searches were not available, two of my subjects. They actually came under fire and water. Flooding in the basement of the Simpson County courthouse destroyed all those records. And then fire at the National Military Personnel Record Center destroyed any information of Durr's military record. Is there an importance now to conserving all of this information so that fires and rain don't get to them? That's one thing about the internet now, or our computers, that we can store things on a little bitty thumb drive and it's there unless you lose it, which probably happens too. So the verdict was guilty after they reviewed the case in the Supreme Court, and the justices concurred with the verdict and ordered that Jim Brent Durr be put to death on July the 25th, 1952. Now that's almost a year later, or it's more than a year later. One of the articles that I was able to find described his last moments and said that his last words were, "I wish I could have seen my family." There's an interesting note about the trial itself, and I found this information in the newspaper. The case was the first to have Negroes sit on a grand jury, and that jury indicted a black man. There was one black juror that sat on the jury that convicted Jim Brent Durr, a black man. But what was happening in Mississippi is the civil rights movement, and elected officials were beginning to be aware that change was coming. Other counties had already started having blacks on juries. They did this to ensure that the cases would not be thrown out for lack of diversity on the jury or the constitutional right to vote. The controversy and the Constitution right to be called for jury duty. If you had black voters, then you needed a black on the jury. And so Simpson County fell in line with all the other counties. And I think, and I don't have the exact name, but I believe what happened was there was a trial over in Alabama where several young black men were tried. There were no Negroes on the jury, and it was thrown out. The case was thrown out because of that. And so that precedent was set, and everybody had to start following it. Now let's talk about that portable electric chair. That seemed, people who have read the book say that's one of their favorite parts. And I thought, oh my Lord, that horrible portable electric chair. The story about the chair hit very close to home. After the Mississippi legislature appropriated enough money to build the thing, $4,000, they learned that Parchman did not want it up there. Parchman, a home of our penitentiary. They did not want to be known as the Center for Execution, the Center for Killings. So state law helped them out with that issue. The law stated that the punishment for a crime must take place in the county in which the crime occurred. Thus, the portable part. A company in Memphis, Tennessee took on the task of building it, and Mississippi had its one-of-a-kind electric chair and put it into business. A few years before Jim Brent Durr died in it, the famous Willie McGee case was final over in Laurel. It started in 45, and in 50, he was executed in that same chair. Took him, there were that many appeals, but it became a very famous trial. And if you ever get around to it, I recommend this book right here, The Eyes of Willie McGee. It's one of the best I have ever read. And it details how the changes came and how they were answered by putting blacks on juries. But anyway, that chair was more famous for Willie McGee than Jim Brent. But I find it interesting that citizens' concern over punishment affects what legislators do to honor their concerns. Note that hanging was way too gruesome for the crowds. So they went for the portable electric chair, or the electric chair, depending on which state. We had one of only two in Mississippi. I believe the other one was from New York. Now, that's probably the only time in history that New York and Mississippi had anything in common. Even today, this subject comes up often, and that's the punishment. And so where we are now is punishment by injection of medicine. This is killing by using the medical process of injecting medicine into the arm. It's also pretty difficult. I think we've just reached a time, or going through a time, when death penalties have been eliminated or just put on hold. Probably the last 10 years. Killing someone is not easy, especially when it's in full view of the public through media reporting. Actually, it's no longer a spectator sport. You can't have a crowd out in the yard watching. Of course, our chair, and it was ours, our chair, being the first portable electric chair, seems that Mississippi has a lock on being first in many bad, crazy, or comical things. The too close for comfort for me was a picture handed to me by Joe White in Mendenhall, a former writer of the Clarion Ledger and now a bookstore owner on Main Street, McGee. Mr. Thompson was a former Navy man. He was the first executioner. And he had tattoos on every inch of his body, starting at the neck and going all the way down. He was made famous as he traveled around the state to show children what could happen. He traveled with the electric chair and show kids what could happen if they got astray. There were a lot of featured newspaper articles on our electric chair all over the world, some even from England. Unfortunately, I could not use this information in my book because Thompson was not the one who killed Jim Brent Durr. Another executioner did that. But thank God Thompson was from Delo, not Mendenhall. If you want to know more about the chair, look up Robert Walsh's article on the internet. After the charges were dropped to Martha Lee, she began a new journey. First of all, her neighbors and her friends encouraged Martha Lee to leave Simpson County and get out of there. They were all scared to death that the Ku Klux Klan may harm her and her family. She had gotten a lot of advice and help in a plan to get out. She mostly stayed around the house at Willie Bell's. Couldn't go out. She was scared to death. So with help from family members, they got her up to the Mississippi Delta, where she stayed with some of Jim Brent's family. She continued working there. She worked picking cotton to have money to get her children out and to start a new life. Willie Bell kept Martha Lee's children in her home while she was gone. The rest of her story continues in the final chapters of the book, where she met and married a new husband. She worked in numerous jobs and added more children to the family, and how she got help from her community down there in Skipper, and how today she is surrounded by all of her children and friends. I don't know if any of you know how big a cotton sack is, but I think it's about 10 feet long. I had the opportunity one time to pick cotton. And it certainly propelled me into the importance of having a college education. That's something I didn't ever want to do again. But Martha Lee, in order to make that money, probably picked several of those a day. She finally had enough money to help, to buy the gas for somebody to get her out of there. And she went to Gary, Indiana. And one day in the interview, Betty's daughter, and she has such a way of chuckling, and she said she was looking at me because sometimes my face reflects my feelings. My feelings must have been written on my face as I remember how white folks talked about how those Negroes had so many children. Betty began naming all the children and looked into my face. She said, "Now you sit right there and I will explain it all to you. I have a sister who is my exact age. How did that happen? My father was married to my mama. And while he was married to my mama, he had two other women who were his girlfriends. So now I have a sister who is exactly the same age as me. But the women kind of got even because they started sticking together. So the three of them became really good friends, and they took care of each other's children, and the children became part of a tribe around Martha Lee. Martha Lee helped take care of the other women when they were ill and with their funerals. And now Martha Lee is the matriarch of this huge family. And Betty, the other Betty, made me wipe that question off my face pretty well. We still talk about that and how she put me in my place. I needed to be put there. Martha Lee sat by the side of those two women, and that they had all grown, as they had all grown to love each other. She is literally where all of these children come to see Martha Lee. And, and I often thought, and I told Betty, that I should never have questioned that at all, because my mother came from a family of 10 children. So that was out the window. The one thing that I learned from Martha Lee that has been helpful, but it's hard to do, and I'm not sure I've gotten there yet. But at the time of our second interview, the shooting in a black church by a white man in Charleston, South Carolina, was recent news. I asked Martha Lee about those survivors who publicly announced their forgiveness for the man who killed those in the prayer circle. And I just couldn't believe that. I thought, really? So I asked her the question, how did they do it? And she looked at me with the pretty little brown eyes, and she said, on your knees. You pray it away. You cry, you scream, you ask God to put forgiveness in your heart, because here's what's going to happen if you don't. Hate will tear you apart. And there is way too much hate in this world today. So I asked her exactly where she is today. And she said, I have peace in my soul. And I thought, heavenly days, not many have that. Martha Lee and I are good friends, and I learned so much from this amazing woman. I am grateful that she allowed me to tell her story. But by the way, there are questions all through that will never be answered. But I believe that even though it was not in the appeal at the Supreme Court, the story about her getting in a fight with the constable, I believe it was true, that it was true. I believe she was charged with accessory to murder on that one thing, because that's all that she did that would put her in a position to be accessory to a murder. So I believe her when she told me that. And I thanked her for her honesty. And I wish Martha Lee well. She at 94, she is still as spry as a cricket. Thank you.
Hey, thank you for that. I wanted to go back for a minute. We have some questions, but before we get to all of those, the incident there at the farm when the constable was shot, as you noted, there's the official court reports, and then there's Ms. Hall's recollections, but they are pretty different. Could you talk a little bit about?
Not all the way through.
No. But in things like, well, for instance, the second gun is left out of the, or I guess the third gun, the constable's brother's gun is not in the official court reports.
Right, in the appeal.
Right.
It was not there. No. And I called that out to her.
Right.
And she said, I don't care. That's what happened.
Yeah.
You do have questions about those things, but she stood her guns with him, and I still believe that's what happened. I really think that what really happened is they wanted to get her charges dropped and get this over with.
Yeah.
So
there are the 4 adults there at the farm, and then the constable is shot. And can you talk a little bit about, so then the constable's brother was with him. He leaves. What did the Durrs do at that point?
Well, at that point, Jim Brent left. He immediately left. He went over to somebody's house and got $15, and I think that's what's in the book. And then he took off. and just left Martha Lee there having to deal with all of it. And she was very pregnant at that point, but she was so small in the pictures, you can't even tell that.
In the book, you
Yeah.
write that, and you mentioned this earlier, but it's certainly one of the compelling moments in it too. The nighttime journey through the woods that an 8 months pregnant Martha Lee Durr has to make with her young children walking in tow behind her.
Yeah. Have you ever seen a street light out in the country?
You broke up on me just a second there. Would you repeat your question? Have you ever seen a?
They're not out there. It's dark.
Yeah.
I said, have you ever seen a street light out in the country? They don't even,
Right.
you know.
Right.
So it's dark. It's everything that happens a lot in the book. It was pure dark. It was black dark. And so it was quite an ordeal getting there, although I'm sure they had a path that they were on.
But so her husband, Jim Brent Durr, leaves to sort of try to not be killed in the middle of the night, or be arrested. And she wants to make it to her father's house, so she and the children go there. And then after that, eventually, go ahead.
I believe she went to Willie Bell's house.
To Willie
Her
Bell's
sister's house, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then regardless, then there's also a little bit of uncertainty in the recollections about whether Jim Brent Durr was captured or turned himself in. Martha Lee Durr remembers maybe that relatives talked him into turning himself in.
I think that's what she said. I believe that she said that someone talked him into doing that. And they ended up finding him in the trunk of a car. Now, what happened, according to the appeal, is they picked him up and they took him straight to the jail in Hinds County, because it's like 3 or 4 stories high and well guarded. So any black person who was arrested in Mississippi during that time for such a thing as egregious as murder, they were taken to that jail for safety purposes.
Yeah.
And that's what they did with him. And then they came back and turned him back over to the Simpson County sheriff, who kept him in the Mendenhall jail for some time. And then they took him back to the jail in Hinds County, probably after the trial.
And of course, one of the great tragedies of the book and of the story is what happened with Martha Lee Durr when they were looking for, in that time before they had Jim Brent Durr, they questioned her. Could you talk about that a little bit? Well,
yeah, they picked her up at the house. I think it was Willie Bell's house. It might have been, I'm not really, I don't remember that part. Mm-hmm. But they picked her up and took her in custody from that house. And then they drove over to the church and started trying to get the information about where Jim Brent Durr went. And she kept telling them, I don't know. I have no idea. He just left.
And she says they beat her.
Well, yeah, she calls it beating.
Yeah.
I think probably, and this is just my opinion, I think they probably pushed her around. I mean, I've seen this. In my day, I saw how some blacks were treated. Mm-hmm. And, they push them and push and slap them around. And I'm sure she said she was beaten. So that's her story.
And then certainly was jailed while she was 8 months pregnant. Can you tell us what happened to that pregnancy then?
Well, what happened was she was on her knees in the jail cell and started throwing up. And so they took her down to McGee, because McGee had the only hospital at that point. They took her down there, and Dr. Charles Pruitt Sr. saw to her, and she lost the baby there in the hospital. And then the sheriff of Simpson County was Sam Johnson, who was a really good guy. I mean, I interviewed Sam Johnson at one point when we had the newspaper, and he did the march in Bataan during World War II. So he was a really good guy. So he got his maid to let Martha Lee come in and stay with her until she recovered, which I thought was a very humane thing. And then after she recovered, then she went back to the Mendenhall jail.
Right. And her sister had kept their 3 children during that whole time.
Yeah.
And then eventually, Martha Lee Durr is released from jail. She comes back. She goes to the Delta, like you said, got a job there, but eventually made her way farther north with her children, or I guess made her way farther north, met and remarried.
Well, no, what happened was the children stayed with Jim Brent Durr's sister and Martha Lee left and went to Gary, Indiana with some more, where some more relatives were.
Right.
It was different from the Underground Railroad because she was riding in different cars to get up there. But they had some system worked out. And so she ended up in Gary, Indiana with more relatives.
And she remarried there.
Yes.
And then after that, they came down, and there's a story about how she was able to get her children at that point.
Yes.
Which,
well, she was told that they had to go see the man. This was on a plantation. She had to go see a man before he, get permission to take the kids. And so she and her husband loaded up to take the kids somewhere. Oh, to go see the man. That's what they did. She was wanting to go see the man to get permission. So they loaded up the car with the kids, took no clothes because they didn't want anybody knowing they weren't going to go see the man. So they got in the car and left and drove back to Gary, Indiana.
right.
They stopped somewhere on the way and bought some clothes for the kids.
And lived there in Gary for years, but now she lives in Michigan.
Right,
as a widow.
I'm sure, I'm not clear about that. I know that at some point they, including her husband, moved to Grand Rapids.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions and a couple of comments. Savina Schoenhofer asks, or says, Betty, thank you for this. When you saw the electric chair, you and your brother, were you excited, afraid, appalled, sad, or what? What were a child's thoughts on seeing this instrument of death in your town?
Well, at first we thought we were just having a lot of fun, on our bikes, and we were like part of the parade coming up the hill. But once we were up there and the truck was on the street, and they brought it in on the sidewalk, and on either side of the entrance, there's a big cement slab, and you could sit on that. And my brother and I had gone on ahead and got us a good seat. We were just having a ball. And as that thing came by me, when it got close and I could see the metal part that was going to go around the head, and the strap on the hand on the side arm kind of fell over right in front of me. It was like this far from my head. And I just immediately, I got sick at my stomach. And then I thought, this is not fun. You are not having fun. And a man is going to die in that thing. And I literally got sick. And so I went home, and then that night, my mother would not have allowed us to go up where they were executing that guy. Now we were gonna talk about this thing being self-published, don't forget to ask that question.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll get to that. We've got a few more questions in a few more minutes. Sarah Campbell asks, did Mrs. Hall talk about her expectations for justice in the community?
In the community, meaning Skiffer?
Yes, ma'am. In the
They were
African-American, well, in the African-American community.
Yeah. I don't think she addressed that. It was implied all through, with Willie Bell talking about they would walk to school and the yellow bus with all the white kids would pass them. But then both Martha Lee and Willie Bell talked about several white families in the McGee area who helped them. And they wanted to bring that out. They even had really kind words to say about Mrs. Harrington. They said she was just one of the finest women that you could ever meat.
The widow of the constable, Bernice Harrington, who...
Yeah, that's his wife. Yeah. And they were quite, impressed with the woman and how sweet she was. But other people would have told you that Miss Harrington is a really nice woman. So I don't know that we really got into the Justice Department because it was implied all the way through.
Yeah. In the book, you write about also how before going to the Delta, she tried to remain there in Simpson County and work. She found work as a domestic in McGee, but then lost that position.
When somebody identified her
Right.
as Jim Brent Durr's wife. That job, she was let go.
Right. So had trouble finding work there. She also had court-appointed attorneys. Mm-hmm. And there's a horrific story that she tells that you recount in the book about what happened to her during that same period with her attorney.
Well, he was not her attorney. He was Jim Brent's attorney that you're talking about.
Okay.
She had her own county-appointed lawyer, and she could not remember his name, nor could I find any evidence of who he was.
Yeah.
So he does not exist in the research. I couldn't find anything about him.
But the attorney who propositions her, who more than propositions her.
Right. I don't know who it was. Have no idea.
But could you tell us a little bit about what she said about that incident?
Well, she said that she was scared to death not to, basically. He approached her, and she said, yeah, I mean, here, she's still scared to death, and everything that's happening to her is just not good.
Yeah.
But as far as sexual activity between a black woman and a white man, one of the books that was so helpful to me was called An American Dilemma. Mm-hmm. And it's research, it's a sociology book.
Yeah.
And it's very thick, as you can see. But there are several chapters in here about white men having sex with a black woman. And it was pretty common, which surprised me. But if you're really interested in all that, pick up this book and look through it. It also is one of the most helpful things I ever read. Because basically what it said is, after the Emancipation Proclamation, after all this research, this author of this book and the one that followed it said the best thing that we need to do is to start educating these people, because they're not educated, they don't know how to do it. And we didn't do that. We missed a good chance.
Right. That's right. We have a comment from Kay Lundy who says, Betty, I visited 2 chateaux in France, side by side, of Queen and King's mistress who cared for their children and lived to ripe old ages after the king died. Women made do and even thrived with their cheater husbands, she says.
Hello, Kay Lundy, you crazy thing. Of course I would get a question by you. Okay, well, they just brought that over on the boats, I guess.
Yeah.
Since it's just a statement, I don't have an answer.
Yeah. We have another question. Did you research the role of the constable?
Well, I just knew it. All my years as a printer's devil, and then college, and then owning your own newspaper. About the elected officials, and a constable is an elected official. Still to this day, but the primary thing that they did or do is serve subpoenas, just to handle the busy work, like things like that, and serve, like he was serving a document to Jim Brent. That was their primary role, and it still is.
I can't remember if I read this in your book or in one of the newspaper articles that you refer to, but I thought it was interesting that the constable's pistol was borrowed, that it was not government issued.
Oh, you must have read that somewhere else. I don't remember that.
You had talked about your history there with newspapers. I'm curious, were you aware of any Simpson County lynchings during those decades?
No.
Got another question here. Hold on, let me get back up to it. It was a question about the community of Skiffer. How large, just sort of, what was Skiffer like then, and what is it now? There were, it sounds like black families and white families in close proximity farming.
It still is. What I didn't include in my talk was the interview with Cecil Harrington. Now, Cecil was Bernice's son, and he ran for sheriff of Simpson County and got elected. And according to an interview with him, the African American folks who lived in his community supported him, and Cecil and his brother were able to be there when Jim Brent Durr was electrocuted. And he made the comment that Durr never had a chance. He was guilty before the trial started. So unfortunately, Cecil died not too long ago. But it was, he described the community, how that a lot of the black men during harvesting time would come over and help them out, and they'd have lunch out on the picnic tables. But yes, all of the troubles that were there between the whites and the blacks, and it just had gotten worse with things like this. But they still do it out there, and now you've got a lot of brick homes out there owned by African Americans, and a lot of homes owned by whites, and they live together out there.
So it's still a community that exists, and it's a few miles outside McGee.
Yeah, it's got its own water tower out there.
That's Mississippi of knowing when you're an official community.
Yeah.
You mentioned the interviewee saying that Jim Durr was done for before the trial ever started. One of the things that Martha Lee Hall is quoted by you as saying in the book is that Jim Brent had, quote, tried to get her to lie on the stand. Do you know any more about that than?
No, at that time, during the interviews, I think she was like 90 years old. Mm-hmm. Sometimes she would just say, I just can't recall that.
Yeah.
And at 94, that's probably right.
Yeah.
But she did testify. But without a copy of the actual trial, I couldn't get that information.
Right. You have interviewed her several times for the book. You have published this book yourself. You are splitting the proceeds of the book with her.
Well, at the time, I had put it out to some book companies, and they'd just gotten, it got nixed, basically. Mm-hmm. And I was having no luck with that. And she was like 91 and 92, and I said, doggone it. I need to get this book out before something happens to Martha Lee. And I talked to a few people and got some really good advice. I said, just, if you can, just self-publish. Mm-hmm. Because I was getting a little worried. And so I did. I found a company called Ex Libris. And for anybody who's thinking about self-publishing, let me tell you, there are more steps to it than you would ever imagine. And but I did that for Martha Lee. And yes, I am splitting all of the royalties with her 50%. So it's her story. And, there are places in there probably that are not just right. But memories at our ages kind of get a little testy. They just don't come up all the time.
And the book is available in bookstores, and can you order it off of Amazon as well?
Yeah, yes, you can. I wish you wouldn't, but I would prefer you get it. Did I say that? From a private bookseller.
Better independent bookstores near you. That's right. Well,
that's right.
Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you all for tuning in and hearing this story. I hope that you will, again, join us next week when we'll have Kate Clifford Larson talking about Fannie Lou Hamer, whom she's written a new biography about. Betty Dickson, we look forward to working with you more in the future as you find more tales to tell. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.